Good morning. So what I thought I'd do today is also again pick up on what we started talking about yesterday, so there's some continuity, and also we can explain some things that were not quite resolved yesterday, including the discussion of Houseman's Paris, which was not in my plan, but I thought I'd throw in some slides to discuss that. So we were talking about Philadelphia last time, and the fact that it is a gridded city. It is an Anglo-colonial city, and we're going to look at some grid plans. And following up on Shilpa's point that why we're looking at gridded cities, there are some, it is useful to look at all kinds of models of cities, but gridded cities are of a particular ilk, and there are different kinds of gridded cities. So when it comes to Philadelphia, what we have here is that there is a central square, and there are 4 squares which were sort of symmetrically positioned, and the plan occupies the area between the Delaware and the Schuylkill River. And there is one street that joins the 2 rivers, and then there is a north-south street. Now that seems like very, organized, very rational, and the sort of equal distribution of space, if you will. Now, it is evident from this map that some streets, like the one, the east-west street, might have been, there's some plans certainly of that being developed first, but the equivalence of this plan was sort of, overtaken by other needs. But first of all, where does the plan come from? And the origination of the plan, the model of the plan, comes from plans that were, suggested when London burned down in 1666. A big chunk of late medieval, early modern London burns down. And several architects, and these are all architects turned planners, remember, there's no, nothing called the discipline of planning at that time. There's no discipline of planning until the First World War. Okay, so most of these architects are working as planners. So they had proposed multiple, different architects had proposed different visions of what the city could be. One was Richard Newcourt's plan, which is this one here. And it shows a central square, those 4 squares, and each, let's call it, use the American term block, again having a square with those streets. So very symmetrical, very modular plan. And of course, it was very inimical to anything London had. And none of these plans that were proposed were actually adopted, because London's land politics and politics in general was very complex. Nothing could be done by fiat, like just erase whatever was there and put down a gridded city. But there is another, sort of potential source of this plan, which is Londonderry in Ulster, Ireland. These are colonial cities. This is a fortified colonial city, and we see the same sort of logic here in terms of central square and dominant east-west and north-south streets. Now, in a way, these things don't explain a whole lot. I mean, again, this is going back to Delupton's point that you can intend whatever, planners, architects, authorities can intend a certain model of living, but that doesn't mean that's always adapted or followed. Now, there was another aspect, since I mentioned yesterday, that one of the deals for investors who were going to buy land in Philadelphia is that there is a dual, deal that you buy land in the country and you get, 10 acres in the city. So 500 acres to 10 acres. That was the offer. But Thomas Penn, Penn's successor, also started planning towns in Pennsylvania, apart from Philadelphia, that is, following the same logic, and this is more close to the logic of Londonry, which is very much a colonial imposition. And what is instructive here is that what you have in the city center here, this part, is a church, market, and court and prison. So these are the three main building types or institutions that are being placed in the center as the figure of the town, resembling what the town and representing the town. And something to think about, why these three? So I would like to hear a little discussion about why do you think these three were placed? I mean, it tells you something about, 17th, 18th century Pennsylvania in this case. So why church, market, and courthouse and prison? What do they represent? Or what do they seek to do?
The location in the center might have ensured legal institutions and religious institutions at the core. For the market, I think it was to bring people together, but specifically it was for the purpose of trade and network.
So it's interesting because it's a port city, right? It's a riverine city, it's a port city. So the ports are far from the center, mind you, okay? Ports are not close to the center. So there's no reason to believe the center of trade is going to be there, but it's a market. So one has to think about, again, the notion of market has changed a lot over the years, but it tells you that this is already being considered as, in terms of a religious institution, a legal, authoritative legal institution. This is, and also it has not just a courthouse, it has a prison. In other words, this is in the institution of the church and the institution of law and order are being brought together in one space. And it could be a very nefarious kind of combination, as we all know. And this was not uncommon in Spanish colonial towns. But as we will look at Calcutta later, and I want you to think about what building types were proposed or built in the initial sort of the years of the city to make it work as a colonial, very much a colonial city. Okay? And there was already a kind of a well-rounded idea by the mid-18th century what this was going to be. The central square is going to have now the term is State House, and there is a representation of what this would look like. A tall building with a tower and with wings. In other words, the wings means it's a Palladian plan. There's a main body of the building, and then there are two wings, and there are sort of the kind of a guarding the center, if you will. And again, the Philadelphia is here between these two rivers. Okay, this is Delaware. This is the broader river. So it's kind of placed smack between those two rivers. Keep that in mind. Now, what about, it's one thing to plan, kind of a gridded city, which you presume is done on paper. The other thing to actually place it on the topography. Now, there was actually a significant difference between the land. The land is not flat. It has a contour, and there's a significant difference between the banks and the river. That, there's a level difference between the land and the water level. And this is something that had to be negotiated. I introduced this because we're going to look at Calcutta, and most Indian river cities have a particular water infrastructure connected to them, which is very different from these. Now, no matter which city you're looking at, whether you're looking at New York or Philadelphia, you still have to negotiate the edge between the land and the water. And it is very typical, whether it's London, New York, or Philadelphia, there are actually always steps, and they're called step landings. That's what these are. And mind you, just so you know, these are actually conjectural sketches of what it must have been, and these were prepared for the Centennial exhibition. So these are 19th century productions. So this is, in other words, imagining the past from records, but also, it is a representation after all. So it's trying to sort of map what the city was like and what it is now and how it can be changed. There's always an implication of how it can be changed. But this one was very much a celebration of what the city has become. So to keep this in mind, because as you can see, these are, one of the effects of these, stairs is that many of these buildings here, they were actually split level. You know, one part could be 1 story, other part could be 2 story, just because of the grade level, you know, the grade change, which is not how, however, the riverine cities of, let's say, the Gangetic Plains are built, because there is no significant difference whether these cities are located between the level of the land and level of the water. So in other words, you have to negotiate. That's very important for trade, for commerce, and for everyday use. Now, then that's the first article you read, which talks about the use of grid as an artifact. You can think of it as a made thing, as a thing in itself, that you impose on the land. It's a construction. So what happened in practice was the Delaware Edge got built up first, and it should not come as a surprise, because that is, you know, there's more trade on that side. So that side, as it indicated by these hatchings here, got built up first, and the square didn't even get touched for until the, basically the 19th century, because it is really far from where real business is. And these are, whether we're talking about Chicago, whether we're talking about Philadelphia, whether we're talking about Calcutta, remember, in the 18th, 19th century, these are crass commercial cities. If there is no trade, there is nothing, basically. Okay, so that's very important for them to think. You have to think about, like, switch your gears and think, like, this is about trade. These cities are about trade, and they're trying to grab as much trade as possible. To make it, in fact, what would happen is that the city authorities' goal would be to attract as much trade as possible without letting go of their own dominance, whoever there is in power. So one of the, the grid as an artifact lays down a certain inhabitable space. How it is used, differs. But the grid as a metaphor, as a sort of metaphor of orderly space, implies that each citizen would sort of inhabit a transparent space. That it is, the grid evokes this notion of transparency, which is quite fictional. Actually, you could just as well hem in a grid in any which way you want. In other words, you can make the grid opaque. But as a grid, as a visual artifact, is very easily subverted. The notion of equality of these, little squares, arranged in this even order, it's easily possible for someone, one person or one, agency, to just buy up a huge chunk of it. Then you don't have the equivalency that is apparent in the grid. There might still be some, in terms of passage, in terms of transportation, some kind of grid-like structure, but that doesn't mean it operates like that in terms of what we would say today as real estate. In other words, in terms of landed property, who occupies how much land. So something to think about is that the grid, despite its orderly demeanor and intention, is anything but homogeneous and anything but really orderly. In other words, you need another power to ensure that the order is maintained, and you need a certain kind of authority to ensure that order. We were talking about, Abhishek invoked Paris yesterday, talking about reshaping of cities. Despite the fact that the grid might have been the ruling model for commercial cities between the 18th and 19th century, there was another model which was preferred certainly by any authority that had imperial ambitions, and that was what was occurring in Paris in the mid-19th century. What we have here is a neo-Baroque plan. I'm going to explain that a bit. The goal is to transform, in the mid-19th century Paris, from a very rebellious city into an orderly, tamed city, and it took some doing. So, but the plan that you see here, all the black lines that you see here, the dark black lines, these are all new streets. These are expansion. These are the large parks that are going to build. Just imagine, even if it is, worked out in a matter of decades, not in one decade, what a complete overhaul of the city that this entails. That means there is always construction going on. means it's uprooting people's lives, people from the neighborhood. It's a tremendous restructuring of the city. In other words, this is to really tame Paris. And much has been written about it. The part that I want to ensure you understand following yesterday's discussion of why this was so disorienting and what kind of population sorting it enabled. So this is what is could be handily described as the crisis of Second Empire Paris. Napoleon III has come to power let's say in a dubious manner. We're not going to discuss the politics of it. This is the moment when of Marx's famous what should I call it? It's almost axiomatic now that history repeats itself. First time as tragedy, second time as farce. This is the farce. Okay, so this is what's happening in Paris. So this is plainly about class warfare, but other things get locked onto it. One is to actually modernize the infrastructure, including the sewage infrastructure, lighting infrastructure, and the road infrastructure. And this is where every time you hear modernization, no matter of which ilk, you should be very wary of what is actually intended, what its outcome is. Because any kind of modernization, and modernity is always offered as an unmitigated good, which almost never it is. Okay? So in other words, it's useful to have a critical approach to these. So what the planning was trying to do is impose a state military order. And again, I mentioned this when Abhishek asked me to explain this, that only the state can change land use laws. Private agents can't do that. So you need the authority of the state for private developers or the bourgeoisie to use their over-accumulated money, and which is going into infrastructure construction. So what do you do when you have a lot of over-accumulated capital? You need infrastructure. So whenever you see infrastructure construction, think about who is investing in it. In other words, how is money being funneled into infrastructure, and whose money is it, and who is really benefiting from it. So it was about, it had multiple, my point is that it had multiple goals. The first goal was to absolutely quell, working class rebellion. And what had happened in the neighborhoods is that they had put up barricades from all kinds of things. There could be carts, there could be furniture, there could be bricks. In other words, you're blocking off streets so that the army or the military cannot enter those neighborhoods. These are tight neighborhoods. If you know anything about, let's say, old Delhi, old Lucknow, or old Calcutta, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Very easy to block off those streets if you wish to, because they're narrow, okay? And in a para or a mahalla, everybody knows everybody, okay? So there is a sort of a tightness of social organization that the state was very keen to break. So roads would be driven through these neighborhoods, like literally, buildings would be destroyed, demolished, and straight roads would be put through this neighborhood to break not just the physical fabric, but also the social fabric of, revolutionary Paris. At the same time, they took the advantage of that to really think about Paris is one of those cities. Something could happen to London. Think of the city sectionally, vertically, that you're doing some things above ground, but you're also taking care of sewage infrastructure and water infrastructure, which is underground. So those things happened as well. And what it produced was, instead of working class quarters and working class housing, spaces for the bourgeoisie, for their living, for their entertainment. So Paris became what we recognize as Paris today, which is a place of the museums and entertainment and theater. But the plan, it's not a grid, it is a neo-Baroque plan, which is a new form of a Baroque plan. What it consists of is that here you have, that's the Seine, and here you have major nodes, and this node happened to be the Arc de Triomphe. So this is the central ceremonial axis of Paris. And the idea is that you're going to create these nodes, nodes like these and run avenues from those with a particular spectacular effect. What you're doing is not just running the roads, but you're also building the entire sort of physical infrastructure next to it. It means all the buildings. So you're rebuilding all of that. One way to think about a Baroque plan or a neo-Baroque plan, and it comes very much, the model comes from Louis XIV's Versailles, his chateau planned outside of Paris, not in Paris. He wanted to move away from Paris, from the mercantile influence of Paris, and elaborate version of the state, physical demonstration of the might of the emergent French state in the 17th century. So what you have here in terms of a Baroque plan is that it's an enormous territory. The palace is actually just this part. Just this part. The rest is, yes, gardens. All of this is the gardens of Versailles. If you haven't read it, she has a beautiful, it's a wonderful book, Chandra Mukherjee's Territorial Ambitions and the Gardens of Versailles. If you're interested in landscaping and modernization in terms of infrastructure, it's a must read. It shows how military technology was harnessed not just to build the garden, we think of gardens as pretty things, they're far from it, to harness to build the garden, because this is actually, it looks flat because it's not drawn as a plan. This is actually graded. There's actually a land, there's a deeply graded landscape. In other words, there's a level difference from between here and here. So the idea of a Baroque plan is that it's actually de Lupton's kind of description. It's a connects the dot approach. You want nodes where the monuments are, and the monument could be a palace, but it also could be a fountain or something, an obelisk. And this is what happened to Rome when Rome was refashioned in terms of a Baroque plan under Pope Sixtus V. So these cities in the sort of the 17th century are kind of undergoing these kinds of rapid, and this is barely a city, it's barely a town even now, but this was a demonstration of the might of the French state, long before France could claim an empire. So this is really the ambition of empire articulated within a palace setting. So what you have here is that, you have these long, what looks like long avenues, these are actually water bodies, and then you have these, you create these nodes and you run these avenues, and some of these are alleys, in other words, garden paths with planting on both sides. So this real, elaborate, description of water bodies, fountains, and replete with allegorical figures or sculptures, always centering everything on the monarch. So everything emanates from the monarch, everything gets dispersed from him, and everything, folds in unto him. So this is the center, and he was styled as Apollo, the Sun King. So his, some effigies of that, sculptural representations of that are all over the garden. So you cannot miss it. It's some kind of, you can clearly see it, some kind of, monarchical anxiety of impressing the court. And really the only people allowed here at the court are the court of the centralness of the monarch. What it did, this is following the Treaty of Westphalia, where those European states who were party to the Treaty of Westphalia had agreed that sovereignty comprised of one king, one religion, one law. In other words, the territorial integrity of countries like France was determined by, it was the outcome of religious warfare. So it had to do with the centralizing sort of the fact of the monarch as the embodiment of the state. So it's very clearly represented in the plan. There's very few plans you can say that you can really see the power of whoever the central authority is elaborated in it. If you ask what are other cities that are sort of modeled on that, Paris of course, but also Washington DC, but also New Delhi. So keep that in mind in case we come to that discussion, because these are all imperial ambitions. and very much of that, where you want to have spectacular, grand, spectacular appearance of greatness. So what happened in Paris was that the reorganization of the street network, replacing old streets, which were cobble streets, narrow, curvy streets, with open, wide open streets, and you're rebuilding, mind you, all of these buildings. In other words, all these streets created not just new road infrastructure, but also built infrastructure like buildings. It created new institutions, but in throwing out much of the working class into the so-called suburbs, the term is banlieue, and ban literally means, to ban, and that it comes from the French term. It is the feudal, medieval meaning, where ban is basically commanding somebody's labor, forcibly commanding somebody's labor, which is also, we use it as, the term ban in terms of excluding something or somebody from something. But that's actually the French term for suburbs. And this is what the suburbs, because we are in the age of photography already, this is what the shanty towns in the suburbs look like. And one of the arguments that the social commentators made at that time, that this is the place that you want to see Paris from. This is the real look of 19th century Paris. Something to keep in mind. And as opposed to the shanty towns and the suburbs, what defined the center of Paris were innumerable new institutions, spaces of entertainments, whether the cafes, theaters, cabarets. Baron Haussmann's supposedly pet project was the Opera House, and this would be the location of the Opera House. What you see underneath here is the existing fabric. All of that was demolished to build the street, which means you're also rebuilding all of this. And this is Camille Pissarro's representation of the Avenue de l'Opera. And this is Charles Garnier's very well-known opera house. It has particular architectural characteristic. It's grand. It is extremely elaborate. It is spectacular. It's meant to be spectacular. So there is a clear, one could say, a dichotomy of spectacular consumption, not just consumption, spectacular consumption, and abject misery, which is being sort of in the shadows of the city, which of course is the story of much urbanization. It's, in a way, Paris is not that exceptional. That moment is exceptional, the form it took is exceptional. I'm going to now sally forth into what I'm calling non-settler colonialism. As I mentioned earlier, the terms settler and non-settler sometimes don't make sense. In some cases they do. There is a distinction among those cities like Philadelphia, which were settled in perpetuity as in colonial occupied territory, as opposed to cities like Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, which are the presidency towns, which had a different logic. Because either land control or political control was never unequivocally in the hands of the British. And this was always a tussle. We can think of moments where the tussle was very strong, and the tussle was very weak, but there was always a tussle. And I would try to call out with the example of Calcutta what these were. So where non-settler colonialism, if you will, differs from settler colonialism is that it is very much the revenue extraction, the labor extraction, the resource extraction is very much directed towards the home country. In other words, you need extractive infrastructure. And that could be simply, roads, railways, but you also need institutions for that. Institutions that can handle that. And so the remitting profits to the home country, what the impact of that is that, if the white settlers invested in Philadelphia and made it their city, excluding the indigenous population, and it's very much a racialized city, like all cities of the US. But in the case of cities like Calcutta, there was very limited investment of Europeans in the city because it was never considered their city. And this is the fundamental tussle, like whose city is it? So there is always a half-hearted, there's a, not just half-hearted, there's always an interest in investing to the extent that we could reap some profit that could be repatriated. Otherwise, it was not worth it. Because to be domiciled in India, for those who were Europeans and British, was to become actually second-rate citizens. Because then you are, you're native. You're very close to being native. So there's a huge politics within the white community about that. Those who were in the military or civil service, who could go home on leave and could come back after 1 year, 6 months, and so on and so forth, were categorically different from those who chose to live in India for good. And there is in other words, their investments are of a very different order. So what I'm talking about here is that what non-settler colonial settlements offered was a fantastic opportunity for investment in terms of as a solution to overaccumulation. But it also required organization of spaces to ensure commercial and political control. And one of the effects of that was that there were distinct social spatial differences that were made between, in terms of white community, in terms of Indian, or as it was said, native community. I also want to point out that the reason I'm picking Calcutta, not simply because I worked on it, is it because in Calcutta these distinctions worked ineffectively. And one has to think about why it worked ineffectively. So you probably know this. This is one audience I shouldn't have to explain this. In the 17th, 18th century, there are multiple European powers who are jockeying for power and trade opportunities all along the peninsula. We're talking about Calcutta here, but there were also other European settlements. And in the holy date of 1690, we don't have to believe it's just 1690, but anyway, it's late 17th century. What you can find in terms of the city is that there is a fort. It's basically a mud fort. It's really not a strong fort per se. There is a very old north-south road. This is the river, and there is some passage towards this spot, which were extensive water bodies. And this area goes into what is the Sundarbans. Okay, so this it's lodged in a peculiar position. Fact is, these towns, where it's Hooghly, Chandanagar, Srirampur, which are further north, they worked effectively when ocean-going vessels could go up that far. But after the, by the late 17th century, that became increasingly impossible because the river was silting up. It's the nature of, the deltaic Ganges. So Calcutta was the place, the location where, to which ocean-going vessels could go and land. That made, so it's not just because there were trading marts there, there were cotton trading marts there, there was a small community there, because it had a very clear logistical reason why Calcutta became the important port. So in the 18th century, until the the first half of the 18th century, what we have here is that this is the fort area. This is the representation of the fort, and earlier there was a church here, and so on and so forth. By this time, this is mid 18th century, there is a building called the Writers' Building, which is basically where the junior clerks of the East India Company were housed, and now of course it's an office. It's been an office for a long time. It's a very large tank, like water body, and you can see that this area is sort of, you know that you could ask, what's the logic of these streets? One argument is that this is really how the banks were next to all the little streams that flowed between the river and the lakes, because here there were creeks that ran across. And they were very clearly mapped in the 18th century. And now we only have names like Creek Road to suggest there was a creek there, but the creeks don't exist. But again, I'm going to come back to this delivery aspect tomorrow. Sorry, I'm confusing my glasses. So what you have here are what you see, all these little notations here. These are the cards, and there are numerous cards. And in the 19th century, there would be more cards would be built. Major institutions, including this is the Bill of Princess 1840s and 19th century representation, the mint being built, and there's a lots of warehouses, markets, and institutions like the mint being built right on the river. And it is not exceptional because this is the most important artery. The rivers were the most important artery into the 19th century. So what would happen with the form of the city is that after the East India Company gains political power and the right to extract revenue in the form of the Diwani of Bengal, the city was reorganized between the mid-18th and mid-19th century. What emerged, and this is very much early 19th century view, is that an old government house, which is the residence and office of the Governor General, later the Viceroy, would be rebuilt in a new form. A new town hall would be built, and here would be the place for ultimately the High Court, but here was the Supreme Court, which was in basically a rented building. So there's like a series of these buildings in front of this very large open area. And this open area was thanks to the newly built, this is mid-18th century, started being built in the mid-18th century, Fort William, and it required a firing field for the 99 cannons which were mounted on it. So you need a clear firing field. So this area is actually really a firing field. The fact that no cannons were ever fired didn't matter, but that open space remained. In Bengali parlance, it has always been called Maidan, or earlier the fort fields, Goreman. But this became an intermediate space that actually become a very elaborate leisure space. But these cards would increase in number to the extent that by the late 19th century, Calcutta had more cards than Varanasi, because Calcutta had a longer riverfront, basically. Calcutta had 84, and that's not including all the suburban ones, right? What the point here is that what would emerge is a dual center of power. This is the center of administration, this is the center of military enforcement. And this admin hub and the fort would become the two sort of the nodes, where this is the extent to which the city could kind of in the 19th century be built, and there was a ditch because of the fear of the Maratha raids. Because what resided after that were mistakenly called the salt lakes. They were never lakes, but this is one of the actually very good representation, 1820 representation of the salt lakes, which means this was seen as a natural barrier. In other words, you could not build beyond that. The goal was to find a path through the lakes that would carry you to, upcountry faster. So we are looking at a particular architecture of neoclassicism, and this is very peculiar to India and definitely to Calcutta. Is that what looks like white painted, and these are of course contemporary photographs. These are also white painted. This is because, remember what I said about neoclassicism yesterday? The whiteness, it's an 18th century construction, but that has been very, studiously, assiduously replicated in modern understanding. And this is not marble. This is chuna. This is actually masonry buildings which are painted, mind you, but to make it look marble-like. So there's a certain kind of affectation of this kind of scene here, and these were, these are the two most dominant buildings on this esplanade. So this when I was about your age and started doing my dissertation, and I had grown up in Calcutta, and I thought I kind of knew something about the city. Wanted to recognize I didn't know anything about the city. I had a day-to-day understanding of the city. But once I started looking at the city, just so you know, this is a 1828 depiction of Esplanade Road by Sheikh Mohammed bin Amir of Korea, actually. And it shows this is the course, and this is basically the area promenade, and the green areas next to it. So in other words, the Maidan offered a vast foreground to sort of display those buildings. And on occasions, the celebrations in Government House actually would spill over to the Maidan because it had this, extended landscape. I was very intrigued by the idea that Calcutta was always described as having a white town and a black town. Colonial cities, it is axiomatic, are understood as dual cities. They were designed as dual cities, or shaped into dual cities by the colonizers. A white city, and then a black city, whether it's an Arab city, Arab Muslim city, whether it's a Indian city or an African city. This white and black is, it's a racialized distinction, a method of exclusion. And I became very intrigued by how that came about, only to realize that, there's really no agreement about where was exactly White Town, where was exactly the Black Town. Most commentators would agree that this part, this is North Calcutta, is where the Indians live. But where is that line? Every account had a different idea. So I actually pointed out, so one would say it's there, one would say this is the part, this is the intermediate town, and then this, or some others would say this is the White Town. Just to note, this is the part of this, in the 19th century, this is close to the suburbs. This area was not even developed in the first half of the 19th century. It was just being developed. Then there are the sparse buildings around here. And this intrigued me. Why is it that Calcutta, didn't follow that rigid model? You do find rigid models in other colonial cities, and they are by law. They are, the most notorious examples are, those cities in African cities. Something that continued into the 1990s is the case of apartheid in South Africa, that Africans had to carry passes. In other words, cities were not meant for Africans. It's very simple. This, of course, was not valid for Calcutta. And it's important to think why. So I wanted to think about the architecture, and I was an architectural historian, like what is in the architecture that allowed this or didn't allow this, and then what I call bodies and space. What is the relationship between bodies and space through which we can understand cities? So what I encountered, what I understood by analyzing these buildings, and this is Government House, and it has a, main hall. It has, this is part of the stage room. There should be a kind of throne here. This is the entry, very grand entry, and this is called a Palladian plan. Named after Italian architect Andrea Palladio, and the Palladian architecture came to England and then to countries like India. And there's something about, it's very much a Mediterranean plan. In other words, it's sort of less suitable for England really than it is for a Mediterranean climate and Indian climate, because it allows a certain openness. You can open up all of these, external doors and windows. This plan has been, the building, Government House, for the longest time has been described as very similar to Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire, which was Lord Curzon's, country home, the family home. And once you look at actually the organization of space, it is nothing like it. and we're not going to go into the details of that. What I want to point out is that this actually has a very clear structural bay. A bay is the distance between two supports. Okay, so this is a 3-bay plan, 1, 2, 3. And all of these doors and windows would be left open because, again, before electricity, you needed air moving if you're going to actually not die. That made sure that even the most, whether it's a private room or a public room, that has a certain kind of openness. It's very characteristic of these old buildings to have very tall doors which were always open, left open to have passage of breeze. And this was not, this is a vocabulary that was shared by all, elite residences in the city. They had, 3-bay plans. They almost invariably had central hall, which was sort of, the way I understood it, equivalent to an open courtyard, except that it's not open, it has a roof over it, but it is also a space of dispersal. In other words, you move through that space. It's not just a space to sit and chat. And that's the idea of room through circulation. Most older designs from the 18th, 19th century, irrespective of where you are in the world, would have room through circulation, that you move from one room to another, but not through a corridor like this. Okay, corridors are very much 19th century inventions. If there are corridors before that, they're doing some other work. But they were not used because notions of privacy and publicness were very different. And this is irrespective of where you are in the world, doesn't matter. So the other thing I noticed is that these spaces, a building like this is just, now the Turf Club on Russell Street. It's a very old building. It was inhabited by Armenian owners in the mid-19th century who were very active in the opium trade. And that's the building, and all of these spaces are the service spaces or servants' quarters. And one of the continual kind of complaint, or it's certainly commentary, of both men and women, European men and women, is that their servants are all over the place. Because government house, well, it's a state, house, could have over 300 servants, and a senior, officer in the EIC or in the military, in the civil service or the military service, could have up to 30 easily. Okay? And so it seemed to them, because they were not used to this, most of them were not used to this, it seemed like, you couldn't go anywhere without being sort of tailed by servants. And it created a certain kind of discomfort bordering on anxiety that, there is no sense of privacy. What is also interesting, if there are going to be 30 people here, this includes stables, storage spaces, that where were these people? The fact is, there was no space for most of the servants in the house or in the premises. These are the compounds, which means they were literally in verandas, in passageways, and in other spaces. What is interesting about government house is the government house here didn't have the servants' quarter at all within the premise. It was across the street. So it is important to have servants' quarters as far away as possible. Okay? And it should not be unfamiliar to you. If you have seen Indian compounds, that's exactly what the pattern is. And it continues. Go to any military cantonment and you'll find that pattern. Okay? What also interested me is that if these spaces were filled with servants, what came of the social relations and social dynamics? How do you inhabit that space? So there's a wonderful representation by Sheikh Zainal bin about Lady Impey. Lady Impey was the wife of Elisha Impey, the Supreme Court Justice, rather notorious, involved in the Nanda Kumar affair. I'm not going to go into all the details, but he was recalled, let's put it this way. So what this shows, and I took some time to analyze the space, representations like this. It shows one of the rooms inside her house, and there's a carpet here. Now, all of these servants would not be there in that same space, but they would be in concentric spaces. Now, this is the gardener. Okay, he's bringing in a platter of, produce. He would sometimes come into that room, but he's not always inhabiting. And these are, the guards. They always wouldn't be in that room. So what this shows is that a set of connected spaces that have been visually brought together within one visual frame, and the carpet does that work of framing. What it also meant that she is the important figure. She's been offered a hat. There's only one European servant. The rest are all Indian, and all are male in this representation. There were few women servants, but overwhelmingly servants were male. And I took some time to understand what this means in terms of visual and spatial connection and social relations within the house. Now, what you might have missed from where you're standing, sitting, is that there's a small figure there, just behind her, fanning her. And if there are so many servants, and this is the pattern of servant spaces in these houses, and I'm taking a chunk of the area onto the east of Chowrangi Road, which is the main north-south road, and that separates the Maidan from the built area, is that if you look at a pattern like this, and you're interpreting a map, the house proper is here, these are the servants' quarters. House proper is here, so in other words, these are buildings in the middle of a lot. Depending on your perspective, you could feel you're very protected or besieged, depending on your perspective, okay? Depending on your relation with your servants. Now, this figure intrigued me. It's a boy. Now, in the 18th century and early 19th century, slavery was not practiced at the scale we see in North America, but slavery was practiced. And this was actually likely a slave boy. We have documentation to suggest this is possible. Now, this is another painting, and this is by Johann Zafny, who was known for painting conversation pieces. I'm happy to explain what that means later. And this shows the Impey family, and this is Elijah Impey, this is Lady Impey, and this is the daughter dancing, quote-unquote, Indian style, with servants, with the smaller child here, and the musical troupe here, and so on and so forth. It's let's call it a kind of a fictive space. It's part of the house, but it's still, it's a setting. It's a conversation setting. And even here, you notice there is a small boy, and we don't know exactly whether it's the same boy, but I became interested in the spatial location of these figures, sort of the interstitial spaces where they are placed, where they barely peek out of the frame. You have to very carefully notice their presence to even understand that they are there. And it tells you something very evocative about how space was experienced and by whom. From Lady Impey, who is clearly in front, and commands the picture, but also likely the slave boy. And it is not an exception. I want you to take a look at this painting. This is the Oriole and Dashwood families. They had an estate in Alipur in Calcutta, in the suburbs of Calcutta, and they're having, they're having tea or likely coffee. There's a chess game going on. Unless the lights are dim, you can't really, see these. But I have I pointed out a few things. There is a little mosque-like figure here, like a building. The jackfruit tree, I always think it's hugely hilarious that it would be painted under a jackfruit tree, because it is synonymous with nobody sits under a jackfruit tree. Okay, you've got to be an idiot to sit under a jackfruit tree. But we'll let that be. It's a representation. And there is a palm tree, and there's a Cash Bengali hut there. This is setting the tropical scene, so you understand this is India, otherwise you won't. And then these are the two families which married into each other, actually three families, the Princeps, Dashwoods, and the Orioles. And here is Charlotte Oriole and Sophie Oriole, the two sisters. And this is a guy, and that's the Khidmatgar or Abdar pouring the water in this urn. And there is a Kubardar here, and there's a Sarkar, and there's a Harkara. In other words, it's a very carefully planned setting. If you are not careful, you will miss that little boy here. And that little boy was definitely, and this is, our history colleagues have done good work tracing who was taken as slave boys by whom. He was gifted to one of the Orioles. And so we have some details about him. So we're on kind of sheerer grounds to think of who this character is. But look at how close that figure is to the sisters. This is what I call intimate space. What does it mean for a slave boy to inhabit that intimate space? So I'm thinking about the proxemics of colonial life. In other words, the proximate locations of figures and bodies, of spaces and how they relate to each other. What can we, let's use the term, map from these visual suggestions and architectural intentions? We started a little late, so I'll take a few more minutes. Now, this is the fabric that I've been mostly discussing. This is, Chorangi, this is Noedan. This is the part that I've been discussing most. But much of the fabric had something like this. This is the north of the city. What it means is that, so this is a building here and open space outside. This is just the reverse. This building on the outside and lots of open space inside. And if these are elite families, they had multiple courtyards in their houses, and they were palaces. There were multiple courtyards. There could be 7, 8 courtyards assembled one next to each other. These were actually unique, very urban forms. These are actually not replicating something that were taken from rural context and planted. This is a kind of a urban invention. And this happens to be, a place I've studied. This is the Shrovaja Rajbari. So these are really large courtyards. Everything was in white. So this is the Shrovaja Rajbari, one side and the other side. And this is a very large space, including a very large tank. So these are some of the most elite families. Even those which are wealthy but middle-class families, you would have nominally at least 2 courtyards. Again, same logic. It's kind of the space, open space is inverted. You're not sitting in, you're not having a notion of a front yard, backyard, and side yard. You want the open space inside because your notion of privacy and publicness is very different. We can talk a little more about what that means. It does create a very different urban fabric because you have the built fabric abutting the street, okay? And that has a uniform townhouse effect, which is the order of most older streets, whether you're looking at London, Philadelphia, or Calcutta. And the larger, this is one side of the Shrovaja Rajbari, they're very elaborate. This is the Thakurdala, where the religious festivals and festivities which take place. That's that space. And these open courtyards, they're public courtyards. You could actually have the entire community there. Could be as wide as 100 or 120 feet long and 60 to 80 feet wide. So they are large spaces. And they're, again, they're enclosed but large spaces. This is the thing that I want where I want to leave today in this lecture. So I've shown you examples of houses which have let's call it a very suburban pattern, where the building is in the center of the compound or the premises, and there's lots of space around. And the other is that the building is right next to the property line, and there are very spacious courtyards inside, which means ultimately the built-up area could be the same. And they create very different urban fabric. And if you're not clear about the term urban fabric, we can discuss it later. One of the reasons Calcutta did not have such strict white and black, borders, if you will, is because you have to ask questions about, who controls the city, which realm is controlled by whom. That's important. So if you want to think about, EIC is the East India Company, who controls commerce? Well, European private traders had upper hand in European trade, no doubt. That's not under contestation. And in the Asian trade, which is, and I'm going to come to that at some point, hopefully, the Asian trade, which is to China and East Asia, both European and Indians had a significant investment. And Indian merchants, this is something the British never quite got out of the hands of the Indian traders. inland trading was very much in the hands of Indians. Never really successfully got into that network. And if you are interested in that, read a wonderful article by Roger Tray, which is about markets, about the bazaars and the bazaar economy. Who controlled, had political administrative power? Well, PIC and civil service, because this is where you control the courts. Means, yes, there are lots of colleagues who have done wonderful work to say you may control the court, but how justice is actually delivered very much dependent on native interlocutors, native assistants. It's a very different proposition. My colleague, architectural historian colleague, Tanya Sengupta, has done very good work on provincial towns in Bengal and looking at circuit houses and kacharis, looking at how you can actually parse power and who really had power, who really had control. Let me put it this way, Indians, okay? Because they were the ones who mediated all transactions. Where the records room worked, they controlled the records room, and so on and so forth. And who controls the army and the police? Well, PIC, and after that works the Raj. Now things get complicated. If you have to think about power in a city, you have to ask who has access to what space, who lives where, and how everyday spaces are organized. Yes, there was a concentration of Europeans in the central and southern parts of the city, highly dependent on native labor. And there were plenty of houses which were actually owned by Indians in that part of the city. Because most land property in the city were in Indian hands. As long as land is in somebody's hand, you never have full power. I'm going to end with that, and we can pick up that line of thought when we resume next time. Thank you.